Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the virtual Wellfleet Public Library Let's Talk Together series. Tonight we have Avi Chomsky. I just have some really quick tips for Zoom, just because it's good to run down these things. Just make sure you're always on mute unless you're asking questions in the Q&A. If you can, make sure your name is spelled correctly in your Zoom profile. That way, when we call on you, there's no mistakes. During the Q&A, if you can use your raise hand icon, that way the moderators can know that you have a question and we'll call on you. You can also write questions in the chat if you prefer not to be heard. Also, we are recording this talk as part of our virtual video library. So if you don't want to be seen in the video, that's totally fine. You can turn off your camera, not necessary at all. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know in the chat. And without further ado, I will introduce Colette Swietnicki, who will then introduce Avi Chomsky.
Hi, thank you, Racine. Welcome, everyone. My name is Colette Swietnicki. This is the 12th summer of this series, Let's Talk Together. And this is our final presentation tonight. Usually, of course, we try to meet in the library in person, but, you know, when you can't do that, Zoom comes to the rescue. So I'd like to thank the Wellfleet Library for being able to manage us on Zoom, and especially tonight, Racine Oxtoby, who is going to assist us in the presentation. On to present Professor Aviva Chomsky, who's a professor of history and the coordinator of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean studies at Salem University here in Massachusetts. Besides being a teacher and author, Professor Chomsky is an activist. Between 1976 and 1977, Professor Chomsky worked for the United Farm Workers Union. She credits this experience with sparking her interest in the Spanish language, in migrant workers and immigration, in labor history, in social movements, in the workings of multinationals, and how global economics forces affect individuals, and how people collectively organize for social change. That's quite an experience. Professor Chomsky was always the first go-to for any questions on immigration or immigration policies. Her two books, Undocumented: How Immigration Became Illegal, and They Take Our Jobs and 20 Other Myths About Immigration, is considered basic reading in any class that deals with immigration policy. She's chronicled the labor struggles of West Indian workers against United Fruit, written about as well as engaged in the fight against corporate power in Colombia, has written a history of Cuban culture and politics in a volume called The Cuban Reader, as well as a volume on Central America's forgotten history, revolution, violence, and the roots of migration. More recent articles of hers circle around the issue of climate justice. Her latest book is titled, Is Science Enough? 40 Critical Questions About Climate Justice. So to get a head start on some of those 40 questions, I'd like to present Professor Chomsky.
Thank you so much, Colette, and thank you to the Wellfleet Library, not only for inviting me here tonight, but this is my 4th or 5th time being part of your summer speaker series. So it's always been a high point of the summer. And I'm really sorry I couldn't be there in person this time, but I'm grateful that you let me switch to doing it via Zoom. This summer has just been too full of other things, and I never made it out to the Cape. So what I am planning to talk about tonight is definitely related to my new book, Is Science Enough? 40 Critical Questions About Climate Justice, and the topic of climate justice. And especially trying to talk about how my career, which Colette, you just described so beautifully, thank you, as a Latin Americanist, has led me to a certain type of understanding of the climate crisis that I find is actually very very far outside of the mainstream. And I guess I would say that the main, aside from the climate denialists, who I'm not even talking about, but the mainstream response to the climate crisis, perhaps we can see in the recent legislation passed by Congress and signed by President Biden that looks to putting a lot of money into alternative energy sources, electric cars, support for research and development and production of things like solar power, wind power, and also a little bit to fossil fuels, but we won't talk about that. But that the solution to the climate crisis is producing more and better stuff. And that actually really goes contrary to my own view of climate justice, which is that for those countries and those individuals who are over consumers in today's world, we really have to shift our thinking and our policies towards how can we consume less stuff. And when I'm talking about stuff, I'm talking about material resources. So we might not think of like solar power as stuff or electric cars, but all of those things are produced by materials that are taken out of the earth and have environmental costs. And especially when you think about it from the context of colonialism and global economic inequality and extractive economies and what that has meant for the countries of Latin America and the peoples of Latin America, as well as other colonized countries around the world, you can see how the questions of climate justice are so tied up with and should be thought about much more centrally and deeply, rather than just, oh, we need new forms of energy production so that we can continue to consume as much energy as we are consuming now with perhaps less or at least different environmental impact, less CO2 emissions, certainly less environmental impact isn't quite as clear. But I'm going to share my screen and show you some slides. See if it will let me do this. So this is not exactly the title of my book. The title of the book is Science Enough? 40 Critical Questions About Climate Justice. But what I'm going to focus on here tonight looks at colonialism, which obviously has been central to all of my work on Latin America, colonialism and climate crisis. So I wanted to start out by going back to those years at the end of the 1970s, after I left the farm workers and went back to college and then straight on into graduate school. And what we were reading when I started my PhD in Latin American history. This was the, most of these works, well, these works were written over the course of the 20th century, but certainly represented a critical approach to the history of colonialism that I was exposed to, and those of us in graduate school in the 1980s were exposed to. Many of these voices coming out of Latin America, and many of them coming from people who outside of Latin America who were writing about Latin America, like E. Bradford Burns, David Barkin, Shelton Davis, or people from Latin America, Eduardo Galeano, Eric Williams, Paulo Freire, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, but making an argument that that countered the conventional wisdom of the 1950s, 1960s about economic development. And the conventional wisdom of the 1950s and 60s was that there is a path to development, all countries need to follow that path to development. Some are further ahead, like the United States, European countries. Some are behind, like the formerly colonized countries. But the path forward for the formerly colonized countries is to become more like the colonizers, but without colonizing, and strangely, without ceasing to be colonized by those colonizing countries. So, for example, Open Veins of Latin America, a kind of classic from the early 1970s by Eduardo Galeano, Uruguayan journalist, historian, talks about 5 centuries of the pillage of a continent, that the economic development that happened in the colonizing countries, the European countries and the United States seen as the ongoing colonizer of Latin America, not necessarily political colonization, but economic and often military and political control as well through military occupation, et cetera, was an economic development model of unequal exchange in which resources were extracted, labor, land, and resources were in Latin America were being used for the enrichment of the countries that then became rich, so that the wealth of the European countries and the United States, the colonizers, was very closely related to the underdevelopment. And then a whole body of literature looking at what is underdevelopment. It's something, it's not a prior state to development, but it's the flip side of the development of the rich countries is the underdevelopment of the poor countries as their labor is exploited, their land is devastated, and their resources are extracted for the benefit of the colonizers. So the poverty of progress, what the colonizers saw, and not only the colonizers, but also in this distorted development, Latin American elites participate in this ideology and in this economic project of extractive development. So the poverty of progress means that what is seen as progress, economic growth, increase in exports, increase in foreign investment, is actually impoverishing for the poor majority. And up until the mid-20th century, this is a poor rural majority who are progressively driven off their lands and move from being the rural poor to being the urban poor. So I start with this literature, and then I move here to my current work to talk about how climate fits into all of this. At the time, certainly in the 1970s and 1980s, we were thinking about environmental issues, and we should have been thinking about climate issues, but we weren't. I certainly confess that I wasn't. It was never mentioned in any of my graduate classes. But I most recently, about 15 years ago, 20 years ago now, learned that our coal-fired power plant in Salem, Massachusetts, which you see in the background in the top left slide, was importing its coal, and you see the big piles of coal there, from the mine that you see in the top right in Colombia, South America, in the very northern part of Colombia, a mine called the Cerrejón mine, which, like so many extractive and destructive industries in Latin America, was started by a US corporation, Exxon. And then since then has shifted to European ownership. It's now owned by Glencore, one of the largest, a Swiss-based mining company, one of the largest in the world, with mining interests all over the world, extracting coal from northern Colombia and shipping it to Salem. And paradoxically enough, one of the reasons that our power plant shifted from Appalachian coal to Colombian coal was environmental. When the federal government, EPA, started regulating the emissions from, and not here talking about CO2 emissions, but ash, coal ash with the various chemical toxins that it contains. When the government started regulating those emissions, the goal was that companies would install technology to reduce their emissions, but instead of doing that, which was expensive, what many power plants did was shift their source of coal to cleaner burning coal like that from Colombia. So when you look at the mine, it looks like an awesome feat of engineering. And of course, when you look at the power plant, you see not only the dust and the ash and the pollution, but you see the electricity that powers my home and the homes of everybody around me. So we see good things as well as seeing bad things. But what we don't see is where the coal actually comes from. And the image at the bottom is an indigenous village called Tamaquito, which has now been displaced and destroyed, one of many dozens of rural villages whose people were uprooted and basically thrown out into the streets to make room for this mine that brings us both pollution and electricity in my hometown of Salem. And the person you see standing in front of the coal plant is Jairo Fuentes Epieyu, who is a member of the Wayuu indigenous people, and he is the traditional leader of the village of Tamaquito, who has led the villagers' struggle for first to stay in their homes, and then when that became obviously impossible, partly because of the contamination from the mine, for a just relocation. And part of his campaign, and those of us who've been working in the US and in Europe to support the campaign of Tamaquito and many other villages in the area that have been displaced, their struggle for a just relocation has been bringing speakers up here. So taking the photograph of Jairo in front of the coal pile was a sort of a dramatic moment, like now you get to see where the coal goes, and you get to see how the people live who enjoy the benefits of the coal that has displaced your people. So I feel like within these three photos, we see both 500 years of colonialism compressed into the present. And we also see why climate change is so much at heart a social justice issue, and that enjoying the benefits of energy use, we have to look at all of the costs that come with those benefits. And certainly the slogan of the mining company is coal for the world, progress for Colombia. But if you think back to the literature that I was looking at, and we were looking at in the first slide, progress maybe have different meanings for different people, and certainly for the people of Tamaquito, the mine has not brought progress, but rather regress. It's brought the loss of their livelihoods, of their homes, of their ability to survive and thrive as a people. Another very important person who important to my political and intellectual development in the coal mining region of Colombia is Jairo Quiros, who is no longer, but was at the time that he gave me this quote, the president of the union at the mine, the union called Sintra Carbón. And here in Salem, the union at the power plant was very much opposed to the environmental organizations that were trying to clean up the plant. And this tension between environmentalists and unions has characterized, certainly there's been a lot of variety in the United States as well. But what I didn't expect from the union in Colombia was their radical commitment to the rights of communities and their really deep critique of the mine and of the economic development model that the mine was bringing, even as the mine provided them with employment. And one of my favorite quotes from Jairo came in a meeting that we had when we brought a delegation to Colombia, and one of the people on the delegation worked for the Sierra Club and was in charge of their Beyond Coal campaign. So they were working to stop the mining of coal. And she asked Jairo, do you agree that we need to stop mining coal? And Jairo looked at her gave her a long look, and then he said, if someone from the United States asks me whether we need to stop mining coal, I'll tell you that you are asking the wrong person. Colombia exports 100% of its coal. We're mining this coal for you. And if you say you are going to shift to clean energy, let me tell you that there is no such thing as clean energy. Every form of energy production starts with the extraction of non-renewable resources from the earth. And I think the point he was trying to make here is that it's really easy for people, over consumers in the United States, to go to Colombia and say, oh, this is so terrible, you're mining this coal here. But the point that he made about clean energy is really central to my book, that there is no such thing as clean energy. There are forms of energy that emit fewer greenhouse gases than fossil fuels, but every form of energy production starts with the extraction of non-renewable resources from the earth. So if you don't want to see mines like the Cerrejón mine, you can't use energy. And I think rethinking our relationship to energy has to be really central to understanding what we mean by climate justice. Because if in the state of Massachusetts, for example, our push for electrification, which I support, has estimates that we're going to double our electricity use in the next 10 years if we successfully electrify everything we need to electrify. Where is that electricity going to come from? Where is the lithium for those batteries going to come from? Where are the rare earth elements for the solar panels going to come from? How much land is going to have to be taken up with solar panels and wind turbines? All of it requires material resources, and we are already way overusing the material resources of the planet. Climate change is only one piece of the larger puzzle. So several concepts that I talk about in the book and that I'm going to talk about here, and I'll go into these in more depth in upcoming slides, but I want to just mention them here so that they'll look a little familiar when we get back to them. One is planetary boundaries and degrowth. Planetary boundaries, the idea that in fact, all of the resources of our planet are finite, and we need to come to terms with the fact that these boundaries are finite and that economic growth means more use of material resources. And if we're going to insist that our overgrown economies keep growing, our overuse of the planet's resources is only going to increase. So the concept of degrowth, that instead of continuing to grow every economy, there are some economies that actually need to shrink in a socially just way. So social justice obviously has to be at the core of this. Colonizing the atmospheric commons, the notion that the Earth's atmosphere belongs to everybody, and colonizers, those who use too many resources, those who burn too many fossil fuels, who use more than our share, are also not only using more than our share of the Earth's resources, but of the resources of the atmosphere. That is, we're putting our trash into the atmosphere, and everybody is suffering the consequences of that. So thinking of that in terms of colonialism. Understanding colonialism as taking different forms, so that neo-colonialism refers to not direct political control. So we could say that we're in a post-colonial era now, because most of the former colonizers no longer have direct colonies, although there's lots of little exceptions to that. But neo-colonialism refers, for example, to the relationship of the United States to Latin America today, or the relationship of international financial institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, to the poor countries where really sovereignty for former colonies doesn't exist because their economic decisions are being made outside of their borders, not in any democratic way, but by outsiders who still control their economies. Global elites, that the global colonial system also created not just rich countries and poor countries, but rich people and poor people, so that within the formerly colonized countries, there is a significant class that belongs to the global elite and that has collaborated with the colonial project. The concept of carbon debt, that the big emitters have incurred a debt by the damage that they have already caused in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions, and they owe this debt to the people who are suffering the consequences. Thus, the concept of climate reparations, that those who have colonized the atmosphere owe reparations to those who are suffering the effects of this colonization. And I have here not only my new book, Is Science Enough, but also a book that we published about this particular mine in Colombia, the people behind Colombian coal, mining multinationals and human rights. And hopefully someday someone will make a slide like my first slide and include the people behind Colombian coal in it. So the concept of degrowth and a good life for all within planetary boundaries. And this comes from the work of the Stockholm Environmental Institute and also the economist Kate Raworth, who conceptualized the economy as a donut. And she has a book called Donut Economics. The inner circle that says social foundation is what we need for everybody on the planet to have a good life. The green area, the donut, lists all of the different areas that constitute this good life in terms of material resources. Everybody needs food, health, education, income and work, peace and justice, political voice. These are basic human rights that everybody should have, and that our global economy should be designed towards guaranteeing for everybody. But we need to accomplish these things while recognizing the ecological ceiling. So we need to design economies that keep us within the donut, where we don't fall below the social foundation shortfall, but we also don't overshoot. And the Stockholm Environmental Institute made these 9 areas in which we are currently or at risk of overshooting the planet's boundaries. So it's climate change is right up at the top, but there's others like nitrogen and phosphorus loading, land conversion, biodiversity loss, where we have already far overshot the planetary boundaries, this ecological ceiling, and others where we're at risk of overshooting the planetary boundaries. So the concept of degrowth plays into this, in that some economies do need to grow and some areas of the economy may need to grow in order to reach the social foundation and not fall inside that, where people don't have access to water, energy, housing, gender equality, but without growing so much that we exceed the ecological ceiling. So the concept of colonizing the atmospheric commons, and one of the things I talk about a lot in the book is the way we count is a political decision. And I use this pie chart on the left, which is one I think that many of us have seen and also seen referred to, and certainly heard referred to by our political leaders who keep saying, well, China is the biggest part of the problem and China is the key to everything. And look, the United States only emits half of what China emits. China emits 28% of the planet's greenhouse gases, and the United States only emits 15%. But what this pie chart, if we conceptualize it like this, it looks like we can easily, pass the buck over to China and say, well, it's your job to do something about this. But what that hides is the concept of per capita emissions, which I show on the right. That is, the reason China emits so much more is because it's so big. Of course, it's a combination of factors. That is, China emits a lot more now than it did 10, 20, 30 years ago because of economic growth. It's now producing and consuming a lot more. And production and consumption requires energy. But in terms of per capita emissions, China is still way below the United States. As we see in the bar graph on the right, the United States per capita emissions are far more than even the other wealthy, high consuming countries of the world, to say nothing of the poor countries of the world, which emit far less per person. So the responsibility of the United States looks very different depending on which chart you look at. Who is colonizing the atmospheric commons? And then just going back to the issue of, in every country, there are vast differences between rich and poor, that still here it's divided between the bottom 50% of the population of each country, which are the blue dots on the left, and the top 10%, which are the red dots on the right. So even poor people in the United States consume more than poor people in other countries, consume and emit more than poor people in other countries. But the rich people in the United States and the rich people everywhere are the ones who are consuming and emitting far more than their fair share. And yet one other really important way to think about history and colonialism is cumulative CO2 emissions worldwide per country. That is, what's emitted in a single year doesn't disappear at the end of the year. We don't start again at zero. And over time, US emissions stand out even more egregiously as far above even much larger countries like China and India, of course, which is way down below. But the cumulative emissions show the long-term colonization of the atmospheric commons. And this leads us to the concept of carbon budget and carbon debt. Carbon budget, if, as now seems increasingly impossible, but if we actually take seriously the goal of the Paris Accords to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C, that is the target, we have a carbon budget that remains of 480 gigatons, period. The current rate of emissions is 42 gigatons per year. That's for the entire planet. That means that the time until the budget runs out is 12 years, actually 11 years now, because this was calculated in late 2021. The amount the US will emit, if we actually reach net zero emissions by 2050, which is far from certain, it's even far from likely. The new legislation does not put us at net zero by 2050. But the amount that we would emit if we were to achieve net zero by 2050 would be 106 gigatons by 2050. That is 22% of the entire planetary budget to remain within the 1.5 degree target. Our fair share of the carbon budget based on our population would be 4%. But even that doesn't explain our entire carbon debt, because we have a carbon debt, owe a carbon debt to the world for our past emissions of 410 gigatons. Our share of excess cumulative emissions over time is 40% of what we have, of what the planet has emitted over what we should have emitted. The global north share of excess cumulative emissions is 92%. The global north being, of course, the former colonizers and still neo-colonizers. And the conclusion here is that the developed countries, those countries that we call developed, which we could just call the high emitting countries, developed countries should consume none of the remaining carbon budget. For true climate justice, we need to pay climate reparations to the rest of the world so that the poorer people and the poorer countries of the world can bring themselves up into that green area of the donut. And we need to bring ourselves down and pay reparations for the damage we have already caused. So this is my last slide. I bring us back to thinking about how this plays out on the ground, where the extractive economy that is promoted as progress in poor countries, in the lands of poor people, actually is direct destruction for them as their communities are displaced. It certainly brings benefits for those of us who overuse electricity, but at the same time, it has caused a huge drought in this region of Colombia, La Guajira, in the northern Caribbean coastal area of Colombia, so that the Wayuu indigenous people, who are the largest indigenous group in Colombia, and who really, until the mine came in the 1980s, lived fairly autonomously with very little state presence. A significant portion of the population uses the Wayuu language as their first language. There's also 65% illiteracy in the province. But they are also the ones who are most dependent on the natural resources of the land and who are suffering the gravest effects of global warming, as their always dry region has been afflicted with years of droughts that have practically destroyed its agricultural potential as well. And this is not only not unique to this area, but is very typical of poorer areas of the world who have contributed the least to climate change and also have the least resources to mitigate or adapt to the changes that are happening for the benefit of other people and continue to be imposed on them to their own detriment. So that is my talk.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions? And does everyone know how to do the little raise hand reaction on Zoom? If you don't, we'll figure it out. Yes, Colette.
Comments, critiques?
Colette, just to make sure you unmute yourself.
Okay, sorry. It's just, Avi, that, you know, when people talk about, you know, just trying to get the pollution decreased in terms of, you know, going to electric and going to solar and all of that, I mean, that seems like such a struggle and a fight, you know, constantly. And yet you talk about degrowth. How would we ever, you know, put a proposition? Can you give an example of something that would come under the title of degrowth in the way we live daily?
Well, for example, I was just talking about this afternoon with the 12-year-old in my life who asked me, so what do you think about electric cars and all this? And I was talking about the new legislation in California saying that, after 2035, no more fossil fuel driven powered cars, new cars can be sold. So gradually turning the fleet over to electric. So yes, but the production of all those electric cars is going to cause huge environmental damage. And really what we need to be doing, and this is an example of degrowth, is moving away from individual cars. And when we talk about electrifying, we should be talking about electrifying public transit and making public transit, improving public transit so that we don't need to depend on our individual cars. So there's lots of examples of this happening around the country as well. The idea of walkable cities. Massachusetts just passed legislation that about building, encouraging building near transit. But, the way our country is laid out is a result of policy. It's a result of government decisions and spending by the government to set us to support the auto industry by making everybody need a car. There's many other wealthy countries where this is not the case. So like degrowth, one of the phrases that that another colleague suggested to me, but that I think really helps to understand it, is that instead of thinking of standard of living as being purely in monetary terms and purely in consumption terms, that every generation just has to consume more than the generation before, we should think of quality of life issues. And I think that's what degrowth really emphasizes, is that we should not be measuring our quality of life by how much we produce and consume, because we can live better with less if we reorganize. And that's what degrowth is talking about. How can we do this? And, before that village of Tamaquito was displaced, I traveled there many times with delegations because until COVID, I was taking a delegation working with Witness for Peace to Colombia every summer to visit the communities affected by the mine and to support their struggles. And when we would visit the old Tamaquito, all of the high-powered rich people from the United States who visited this village were so amazed. And certainly there was a degree of romanticization, like it's beautiful to be there for a few hours, but at the slower pace of life, at the way that children are integrated into daily life. There was a school in the village, a bilingual school that was run by the villagers. And seeing that people can actually live quite well with a lot less than, and that in some ways our overconsumption stresses and burdens us. Doesn't necessarily make our lives better.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because even in terms of, there was an article in the paper yesterday about, in terms of getting electric batteries for electric cars, that we want them to go more and more miles. So the idea is, let's get 300, under our belt. And the article was saying, why don't we start thinking about getting a little bit less, maybe, with each battery? Therefore, maybe we can share it, and other people can have more batteries because there's a limited amount of that around. So it's an interesting take on, the.
And you know, where does the lithium for those batteries
Right.
come from? Everything comes from somewhere. Every product, every commodity has a history. But just another example is, you know, France has banned short flights. So any place you can get in 2.5 hours or less by train, there's no flights, no domestic flights in France. So I think that's another example where, yes, trains have to be a lot better. Like that wouldn't work in the United States because we don't have a train system. But instead of encouraging people to fly more, which is what everything about our country does, from the travel sections in the newspapers to the airport, government support for airport expansion, everything is encouraging us to fly more. We don't necessarily have to completely ban flying, although we probably should. But we could do a lot to simply discourage flying. Instead of making it cheaper the more you fly, you know, like frequent flyer miles and things, we could make it more expensive the more you fly. That would discourage people from flying. We could stop pouring advertising and government resources into promoting people using airlines. You know, just think about traffic, which is sort of a perfect example of how the more you consume, the worse your life gets. Like the more people have cars, the bigger the roads have to be. And the bigger the roads are, the more people get into their cars and the longer it takes you to get anywhere because of traffic. So I think there's a lot of ways that degrowth can be made if we're able to reframe our mindset, and also to understand how economic growth is inherently exploitative, extractive, and destructive. And most people don't want to be exploitative, extractive, and destructive. And if that is made more visible to people, and if alternatives are made more accessible, I don't think it's necessarily going to be an unpopular idea.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we have another question from anyone, any of our viewers?
Yeah. I guess we're all in the degrowth phase.
Oh, yes, Amy, if you want to unmute yourself. I think if you do Alt-A, you should be able to unmute yourself. Hopefully.
Go down at the bottom left, Amy.
Not work. Oh, there it goes.
There you go.
It wasn't clicking off. I feel like my head's going to explode here listening to this. Who could disagree with anything you're saying? But who appoints the king that will stop people from selling their worthless shacks around Wellfleet for $1 million? Who's going to tell people to share the toilet paper on the shelves? We've been through this. Who's going to tell the profiteers in Colombia, well, stop giving into the colonializers? Seriously, who is going to organize this when we can't organize our way into affordable housing around the corner here? What could possibly be more aversive than airline travel these last few years? You don't need to make it any more expensive. They've made it almost near impossible to fly, period. You can't get to Boston from here on a Thursday night or a Friday morning. I mean,
that's one of the reasons that I'm sitting in my kitchen right now instead of in Wellfleet.
When I listen to, I mean, who would disagree with you? But when I listen to you, I have great respect and I agree with everything you say, but where's the king that's going to do this? Or how do we appeal to the good nature inside of people? This is not a new issue. I mean, I'm 74 years old and I've been hearing about this since I was 20, you know, when I was in college. I mean, this is no news. What, if, rather than constantly hearing the list, I need to hear a list of realistic proposals as to how to manage this. Or at least what we ought to be, I mean, in what kind of realistic ways can we ask Texas to degrow? I mean this with all respect.
Mm-hmm. Well, so this is why I like being a Latin Americanist, because we have many examples in Latin American history of political parties, elected governments, revolutionary movements that have been based on the concept of redistribution. We've had much more, I think, experimentation in Latin America. But of course, it's very difficult at the level of a poor country that no matter how much you redistribute within the country, you're still part of the global economic system that is stacked against you in so many ways. And that's why, you know, when we talk about neo-colonialism, but even like, look at the first years of the Nicaraguan Revolution in the early 1980s, before the war diverted so much of the country's resources, with radical redistribution internally and a very small amount of support externally that quickly turned into overt hostility and destruction externally. The Nicaraguan Revolution was able to muster very strong popular support and bring about really dramatic changes in the lives of poor people through redistribution. So redistribution might seem very hard to sell in the United States, but it's not that it's never happened anywhere in the world. But those experiments in redistribution have been very, very threatening to those who benefit from the extractive nature of economies, and they've certainly worked hard against them. But I mean, I guess my answer to you is kind of all of the above. That is, there's not going to be a king who does it without massive popular mobilization. There's not going to be massive popular mobilization without seeing alternatives. There's not going to be seeing alternatives without consciousness raising. And all of those things have to happen at once. And we don't have a lot of time. But building some electric cars is not going to get us there. And you know, I think understanding that the climate crisis is a life or death crisis for large sectors of the world's population now. It's not something that we only need to worry about potentially happening in the future. It's already there. It's already been happening. And like for many people, life on the planet is already unlivable.
Any other questions from our audience?
That didn't feel like a very satisfying answer to your question. But...
Amy again? There you go. Nope, you muted yourself again. You had it for a minute.
Is she trying to unmute?
Oh, there it goes. I don't know why it doesn't. Look, they talk out here all the time about carpeting the area with solar panels and putting wind turbines, and we fight them dumping nuclear waste into our harbors. How do you envision our country? Latin America is Latin America, and it's great if they're making progress. But what we've seen in the last 3 years in this country, how do you see it happening? I guess is what I'm asking. I'm not asking you to appoint a king. I'm simply saying, how do you see it, a method for pursuing what you're describing? We know that it's the last chance we have. Or maybe we don't. I mean, where everything seems to be devolving politically and ideologically, to hear you say these things just makes even willing people, I think, very despondent. I mean, I'm willing to ride the trains. I'm willing to ride buses. I don't want to see the world carpeted with solar. They just did it up here in our dump. I mean, it's great, but they would do it everywhere. They're doing it everywhere out west. I mean, this can't be the answer. You can't get 7 states to decide what they're going to do about the Colorado River. How do you see a way to this?
The European left has put together a project called the Green New Deal for Europe. This is different from the European Green Deal that is being put forth by the EEC. This is a grassroots effort. But if you look up Green New Deal for Europe, they really lay out a very well thought out project for how to combine popular democracy, people's assemblies, and the kind of degrowth, economically transformative changes that need to happen. I think a lot of people in the US right now feel that the system is unsustainable. It's not working for them. But they don't see an alternative. So that's why I guess I feel that both visibilizing how badly the system is not working and articulating what an alternative could look like is an important piece of what needs to be done. But I also just go back to what I was saying earlier about all of the above. That is, there's not one right answer or one right solution. And in this, I really also recommend a novel by Kim Stanley Robinson called Ministry for the Future. I'm sure you have it in the library there. Where I think he also in the novel kind of takes this all of the above. It's a kind of a dystopian fiction set in the future. But looking at the kinds of mobilization that, the multiple kinds of mobilization that start coming to the fore as the climate breakdown gets worse and worse. And I think I follow him in my all of the above kind of approach to, like, there is no one answer, like no magic golden key that's going to do it. But I think that providing the more people see people trying to bring change, the more it starts to seem possible to people, and that the kind of despondence and, well, nothing can be done attitude is also one of the biggest obstacles.
Can you give us the author's name again?
Kim Stanley Robinson,
Kim Stanley Robinson. Thank you.
Ministry for the Future.
Well, it's hard for us to process, I think. I was just getting with the electric cars.
There isn't enough metal on the planet for every one of us to have an electric car.
Yes, I know. Well,
And you know, the thing about flying, only 20% of the planet's population has ever flown in an airplane.
really?
So like, for us, it seems so impossible to imagine a life without flying in airplanes. But for most of the world's population, that is life. It's life without flying in airplanes.
I just wanted to say real quick, that book you recommended, The Ministry for the Future, Wellfleet Library does not have it, but it looks like quite a few other libraries on the Cape does. So we can always order it and send it to Wellfleet if you are interested in checking it out.
Well, there might be a rush for it tomorrow morning.
Yeah, there's already quite a few holds on it. It's very popular. Came out in 2020, but there's 21 holds on it.
Wow.
You should get a copy of it.
I know, yeah, I'll recommend it. I have a message in the chat. Michaela says, in my opinion, the global North's and its leaders' continued willful indifference to the suffering of the global South, despite being the main perpetrators of the crisis, is extremely indicative of the insidious colonialist attitudes that got us here in the first place.
Yeah, I agree.
That's fine, Michaela, for the run-on sentence. That is fine.
But I think there's a combination that exists in many different permutations, but that the indifference is also connected to ignorance, and it may be willful ignorance. But I also think that many people simply don't have access to all of those books that I showed in the first slide, that most people are taught not to question, and they're taught that economic growth is progress and that standard of living has to rise, and these kind of common sense truths that are so deeply built into our culture make it really hard to question them or see beyond them.
All right, well, if we don't have any other questions, we are at an hour. Does anyone have any last notes they'd like to make or any questions they'd like to ask?
I'd like to make sure that we see you next year in person, Professor Chomsky.
I definitely would like to do that.
Okay. So we'll make an invitation right now. Okay. And thank you. It was really a fascinating talk, although a little depressing.
Michaela says, I'm very curious about ecocide as a concept, but I can't think of a way to phrase it into a question. I mean, I feel like ecocide is what we are committing. And most of us, through a combination of not necessarily indifference, but enforced ignorance and lack of alternative. So visibilizing those alternatives, I think, is really important. Okay, anyway, I just didn't want to let that last comment go unacknowledged.
Well, we thank you very much, Dr. Chomsky. come back next year, please.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll hopefully have this up on our website by early next week, if you would like to watch it or recommend it to your friends.
Thank you.
All right.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.